Oh man, here they come again.
Here they come again. This still has skin on the skull.
I don't know why the desert is the initiatory place, but Jack Parsons, who is arguably as famous as Alistair Crowley, he was a guy who, and let me give you a 5-second spiel on him for people who don't know who I'm talking about. Back in the 30s and 40s, he was basically the guy who made rockets useful for the American military. At the time, there were German Nazi scientists trying to make the V2 rocket happen. And in America here, we had these sort of opposing scientists trying to also make a rocket happen. And Jack Parsons was the guy who did that. And they started, he established Jet Propulsion Laboratories, JPL. A lot of people say that's the initials for Jack Parsons, but it's neither here nor there. But they established JPL, which would pave the way for NASA. Okay. And then when you get into NASA, you've got, of course, all these ideas of secret outer space things and going to the moon. Did we go to the moon or not? All these things, right? So anyways, Jack Parsons, while he was a rocket scientist, he was also an occultist, and he followed the works of Alistair Crowley and pursued a lot of these efforts. Well, back in 1946, he went out to the Mojave Desert and channeled an entity, and this entity they called the I don't know how you pronounce it, but the Venusian from the planet Venus, allegedly. And this is from Jacques Vallée, who's a very famous ufologist. He said that this was how it went down. But Jack Parsons, he was out in the desert and he channeled this Venusian entity, and this entity dictated to him an entire book. And Jack Parsons wrote it all down. It's called Liber 49, or the Book of Babylon. And this is important in the history of Alistair Crowley, because Alistair Crowley similarly channeled an entity called AWAS to write the Book of the Law, which is basically the occult sort of Bible for this new age that he was trying to bring about. And then Jack Parsons wrote supposedly the denouement to the Book of the Law, the fourth book. And when he was out in the Mojave Desert, he was out there with Elron Hubbard. Elron Hubbard, of course, the founder of Scientology. And what they were doing was they were using a form of Alistair Crowley's magic rituals, because Alistair Crowley, again, you know, and I'm kind of talking slow because I'm trying to find the right depth, because I don't want the audience to tune out and be like, I don't know who he's talking about. Alistair Crowley, in around 1917, he did a similar ritual called the Amalantra working in New York, and he channeled an entity called Lam, Lam, which means the path. And Lam, if you search the image, you'll see that Lam is basically the first gray alien, first depiction of a gray alien. Big head, big eyes. I think it didn't even have a mouth. So arguably, he made contact with an alien in 1917 using the Amalantra working. Now, what's interesting is that this Amalantra working was based upon Enochian magic. Enochian magic, it goes way back. I'm trying to set up a precedence for, there's a long history of occultists trying to make contact with entities. And one place they can make contact is the desert. That's what we're trying to get at here. But Enochian magic was established by John Dee and Edward Kelly in, I think it was around the 1500s. They made contact with some entities, and those entities said, hey, here's the language. Write this down. This is the language with which you could speak to us. And they wrote it down on this grid, and Alistair Crowley would sort of use that language to make contact, and then Jack Parsons used the same language to make contact out in the deserts of the Mojave. And it's called the Babylon Workings, is the name of the ritual that he did with Elron Hubbard. And we can go into detail on it. I don't want to go off the deep end on you here, but he did this ritual to summon the Scarlet Woman, the Whore of Babylon, they call her, with the purpose of bringing about the apocalypse, which just means the revealing. It wasn't like he did it so that it would trigger a giant nuclear holocaust. He did it to bring about a goddess that they named Babylon, because he thought that she would be the key for mankind to have the revealing and change the world as we know it. And this is a very specifically anti-Christian perspective, because Jack Parsons and Alistair Crowley, they both looked to Christianity as an oppressive control system. So they did this ritual, and he, in fact, meets a redheaded woman named Marjorie Cameron. And then, the story goes deeper here, there, and everywhere. But the point being, to sum it all up, when we see things happening in the desert, there's a long, rich history of occultists using magic rituals that are sort of proven going back to the 1500s and even earlier, if you want to get into, the ideas of alchemy in the Book of Thoth and all these sort of different outlandish ideas for people who don't study this. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. basically, there's rituals to make contact with entities, and the desert is a place in which they would do that. So to hear the story that your guest had relayed about going out of the desert and seeing some very strange activity, I mean, it makes total sense to me. And that's why I was like, this is fascinating that someone actually witnessed this happen. So,
yeah. So, first of all, this is really fascinating because you and I are two different worlds colliding. You do a ton of research. I do next to none. I collect people's stories and talk with them about their experiences. And now it's like, the things you're studying, and now you've heard somebody's story that they've experienced what you've been studying. It can be mind blowing. You mentioned about the Enochian magic, and I would like to. This is really more clarification than anything. How do you spell Enochian? Because years ago, and this might be an episode you want to check out too, I had a guy on, it was episode 122, and I called it secret military Enochian technology, I think is what I called it. Secret military Enochian technology. And I said Enochian, but he said Enochian, but I didn't know what Enochian was. I still don't, but I said, I think you mean Enochian, because in the story, he was in the military, and he was sent on a mission that had a lot of trippy stuff happen. But they were to go retrieve a downed aircraft, and they spent days going through, I don't know if it was jungle or what. He wouldn't tell me where this was, but when they arrived on scene, he said it was a craft that he's never seen before. When they got inside, his job was to retrieve data, retrieve information off this thing. And when he got inside, the language that was written all over, he didn't recognize. So he's going through his manual, trying to figure out what this is even saying. And a scientist came over to him, because they had a team of scientists with him. But a scientist had come over to him and said, "You're not going to find that language in there." And he kind of brushed him off like, "Whatever, dude, let me do my job." And then the scientist doubled down, slammed his hand down on his book and said, "You're not going to find it in there." And he said, "Why not?" And he said, "That's Enochian language." He said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a demon language. Get your shit and let's get out of here." And so then he just, they got their stuff together. I guess he did what he did. It's been years since I've even listened to the story, but the guy that tells this story, I'm still in communication with. This experience for him, it scared him so bad that when he got out of the military, he left the country. He's still out of the country to this day. Him and I have been trying to schedule a time for him to come back on and talk and hang out and stuff, but it's kind of hard with the time difference. But there's been things like that have happened throughout the years on my show. And so when you say Enochian magic, that I'm assuming back then I was thinking like Enoch, Book of Enoch, and that's what he was trying to say. I'm assuming Enochian, is that the same thing, or is it something different?
Yeah, it is actually. It goes back to and yeah, I think I don't know the pronunciations for sure. I same thing. I read so many books and I don't know how the pronunciations are, so I butcher them half the time. But I think it is pronounced Enochian, but then it's then the vowel O is short. Enoch is how I've always heard it pronounced. So that's what I think it is.
Okay.
But it is all connected here, and that's why I was saying there is a lineage you can trace back to the sort of beginning of the written record. And Enoch was the great grandfather to Noah. And I'm not the smartest guy with the Bible, but I think he was one of two people. I think him and Methuselah were the only two that they didn't necessarily die, but they went up to be with God, is the way the verses go. And some people say that means he got abducted by a UFO or whatever. But the Book of Enoch is it's a subject I'm actually researching. I've got enough notes to do a show. I'm just waiting on a couple things to find time to dig into, but it goes back to what do you call pre-diluvian, so before the great flood, but before Noah is where Enoch was around. And in his book, the Book of Enoch, he talks about the idea of the Watchers, which you see in the book of Genesis. You see this idea that there were fallen angels called the Watchers who fell from heaven and went down to earth, and they procreated with women. So you very much have this sort of Rosemary's Baby / Alistair Crowley Moonchild idea of the forbidden, what do you call it? Like the forbidden copulation here of women with these fallen angels, these demonic spirits. And the Watchers, they procreated with the women and created a race of giants called the Nephilim. And allegedly, that's why the flood happened, because God saw this and was appalled by it and did the great flood to wipe out this sort of forbidden, creation that happened. Well, Enoch, and I've seen various things. Some people say Enoch is actually the spirit they call Metatron, and which I found interesting because the artist Santana, the musical artist Santana, he talked about how he channeled Metatron and he played his guitar through Metatron. And then in Kendrick Lamar's, I don't remember which track it is. There's a track where he talks about talking to Metatron or something to that effect, but he does mention it, right? As well as the LDS Mormons, the LDS faith started by Joseph Smith, has a lot of connections with the Freemasons. That's what everybody talks about, and I live in Utah, so I'm it's very heavily predominantly in the culture here. But and you'll see all the symbolism of the compass square and like Saturn stones on the temple and things like that. But the more interesting element to the Joseph Smith LDS story here is the channeling of the entities, because again, just like we talked about with Alistair Crowley and Jack Parsons, they were able to successfully translate or make contact with entities. Joseph Smith also made contact with an entity. That's who dictated to him these golden tablets. I'm not super intelligent on LDS faith, but he channeled an entity. Moroni. That's it. It was Moroni up in New York, and the LDS believe that Adam from the Garden of Eden was ordained into the Melchizedek priesthood somehow through Enoch. And I don't know how the details work on that, but I do know that Joseph Smith making contact with this entity is also of interest to the occult. There's a guy named Damien Eccles who was infamously part of the West Memphis 3 back in the early 2000s and late 90s. There was several documentaries about the West Memphis 3 in Arkansas, and the pitch put forth by the documentaries was that Damien Eccles and two of his buddies, when they were, 17, 18, had murdered some young boys. One, or I don't even remember. A couple boys, one boy, I don't remember. But supposedly they had murdered this boy or multiple boys, and the accusation was that Damien Eccles was reading Alistair Crowley stuff, and he wore black Metallica shirts. And then, the town of Arkansas there, they condemned it because the, satanic panic kind of stuff and the very sort of Christian leanings of the area. So these documentaries, they grabbed everyone's attention. A lot of rockers when it came out and tried to support getting the West Memphis 3 out of prison because they were convicted of murder. And whether or not that happened, I don't know. Wasn't there. But Damien Eccles and the other two accused would eventually be let out of prison on what they call an Alford plea, where they would admit they did it so that they can't sue the state, but they would let them out of prison for time served. So they took it, got out. I don't know if they were guilty or not. No clue. I've read William Ramsey's book that puts together more evidence that suggests they did do it, but again, no idea. It could have, because I believe both things exist, right? I think that you could have Satan worshiping occultists murder somebody. I also think that you could have innocent teenagers who don't fit into the local Christian structure and they get, condemned for it. So both possibilities exist. Either way, Damien Eccles gets out of prison and he's been researching the occult heavily. And he posted about how he came to Utah and was very intrigued. I think he actually, I don't know if he formally is announced as like an LDS Mormon, but he's had a lot of heavy leanings into it because of that, simply because Joseph Smith was able to make contact with this entity. So Enoch's very important to all of these things because the book of Enoch talks about how these fallen angels, the Watchers, not only did they procreate with the women, but they were teaching mankind all these forbidden practices of occultism that you see, like ritual magic and all the things that the Bible tells you not to do. Necromancy and talking to entities, and even cannibalism shows up in the book of Enoch. But it is important in the scheme of the occult and making contact, simply because all of those things exist and you can read about them in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and then of course in the book of Enoch. But then John Dee was kind of the one who dictated and wrote down this language, the Enochian language, in the 1600s, that later on people would also have success in channeling entities.